I am Sean D. Tucker, and this is what I do. I've put my whole adult life into learning how to fly rock and roll aerobatics. I consider it an art form, and I am one of the best in the world.
I got back stick to keep me forward and forward stick to keep me back. That's enough. Oh, yeah. I love my job, folks.
And the reason being is because I'm totally focused and dedicated to learning how to fly that airplane through the sky, upside down, right side up, tail first, tumbling end over end, 10, 15 times, flying backwards for 500 feet.
Oh, that hurt. That was good. That was good.
And what I want to do is be the best aviator that I can be the best aerial entertainer I can be. And what's very, very cool about my job is I'm still learning how to fly that airplane. It is a quest, a challenge.
All right, folks, thanks for coming to practice. You kids, live your dreams, man. Do whatever you want. It's okay.
This particular Mustang behind me is very rare. It's a P51C, which was one of the first models that used the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Still had the high back canopy. The original Mustang was the A model, had the Allison engine, which the P40 had. They started off with those. The British actually had a much better technology with superchargers in the Merlin than we did in the Allison. So at some point somebody said, hey, let's try a Merlin. And the Merlin engine in the Mustang is what made it a great airplane. We actually went on to build Rolls-Royce engines here in the States under license for the Mustang, and as well we turned them out, and the British used them in the Spitfires and the Hurricanes as well. As I said, this is a very rare airplane. There's only maybe 4 or 5 original early airframes with the Merlin on the planet. This particular one is the only one that currently flies right now, so we feel very privileged to have that in the collection. This particular Mustang is painted in the colors of the highest scoring Tuskegee pilot, Lee Archer, who was one of the top Tuskegee Airmen, who were the black fighter pilots that flew for the United States during World War II. Signature markings was the red tail and the red spinner. They didn't actually start using those markings until they started to fly the P-51. Lee was the highest scoring pilot, and I've had the opportunity to meet him. He was out actually when I did some of the test flying in California from this, when the airplane got flying, and he's a great guy, and being associated with the airplane in the Tuskegee colors has introduced me to a lot of really great guys. Really enjoy the company of those guys.
brilliant aeronautical engineer Edgar Schmood headed up the team at North American Aviation, which designed from scratch and flew the prototype P-51 Mustang in just 120 days. The British, for whom the fighter was originally built, quickly found it to be well suited to the roving ground attack mission required in the European theater. When fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang became the quintessential piston engine fighter. It had the range to escort the bombers deep into Germany, engage the Luftwaffe, then continue its close air support mission all the way home. When the United States entered World War II, Charles McGee was an engineering student at the University of Illinois, enrolled in the ROTC program. Learning of an experiment to recruit black men for a flying squadron at nearby Chanute Field, he filled out a pilot application for the Army Air Corps. He soon found himself training in Tuskegee, Alabama. As he progressed through to active duty, he flew the P-40, P-39, and P-47, before flying a Mustang for the first time July 1, 1944. His brilliant military career would continue for 30 years with tours of duty in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He retired as a colonel in 1973. The bright red tails of the fighters flown by the 332nd Fighter Group were often a source of great comfort to the bomber pilots and crews who saw them alongside their formations. The group squadrons had a reputation for fearless, unwavering protection of the bombers. The Commemorative Air Force's Red Tail P-51C restoration features a composite color scheme that honors the men of all four of the group's squadrons. The Minnesota wing of the Commemorative Air Force completed restoration of its first red tail, honoring the Tuskegee Airmen, in 2001. However, in May of 2004, a catastrophic mechanical failure resulted in the loss of that airplane and its project leader and pilot, Don Hinz. The squadron immediately committed to undertake a new red tail project. With years of grassroots fundraising and untold hours of volunteer sweat equity, the new Mustang took to the skies in 2009. In this historic Warbirds in Review, Tuskegee Airman Colonel Charles McGee, along with Doug Rosendahl and Brad Lang of the CAF's Red Tail Squadron, will share firsthand the experiences that connected them to one of the most famous fighting units in the history of the United States Air Force.
My name is Dan Boland. I'm standing in my brother's memorial, Warbird Alley here. Ed Boland was my brother. And Connie, my sister-in-law, started this program 14 years ago. I'm out of breath. She came to me and said, "Brother, I got an idea for a program, and it's already been approved by EAA, and I'm going to call it Warbirds in Review. And what we're going to do is have a moderator who's going to ask questions of an aircraft owner, a World War II airplane at the time, and then whoever restored the airplane will be there as well. And hopefully we'll have an ace that flew it during the war. And we're going to take questions from the audience at the end." And I said, "Connie, what a great idea." I said, "Who did you have in mind for the moderator?" She said, "You." And I'm saying, "Oh, no." I've said, "I'm not comfortable in front of people with a microphone. I've become a little bit better." I said, "I've got a southern accent, every excuse I could think of," but she was persistent. And thank God she was, because it's been one of the most rewarding things of my life. Because of her vision and that of my brother, I have got to meet some of the greatest aviators in history right here at Warbirds in Review. So this is our last program today, and maybe we've saved the best for last, because we're talking about the famous Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen. And we got to... Anyway, that being said, Warbirds in Review, our last program today. I got to thank our sponsors, Scott's Miracle Grow. That's Jim Hagedorn's company. Jim was a fighter pilot in the Air Force, flew F-16s, and he has donated a lot of time and effort and money to this program. Also, Jelly Belly Candy Company has been a great donor to the program. And also Ron Fagan at Fagan Fighters, Ron and Diane Fagan, up in Granite Falls, Minnesota, have been faithful supporters of this program all these years. And here we go, folks. Thank you for attention.
This is such a privilege. Beautiful place, this wonderful plaza, to remember, to honor great aviators, veterans, current active duty aviators, and the civilians. The point of all this is to honor those who have served our country and to maintain all this history. And you all are part of this, and we're grateful that we're here. And again, it's a privilege for me to be part of this. Please welcome Doug Rosendahl. If you look at this airplane, this is a Doug Rosendahl production. Doug?
No, this is the work of a lot of volunteers and a lot of donors over a lot of years to make the Rise Above Squadron and the Red Tail project.
So when did you start it? When did you start this project?
The genesis of the Tuskegee Airman P-51 is that it was a gate guard on Bozeman State College back in the 60s, and they decided that they needed to move it. So the university put it up for auction, and the airplane was bought for $1. And the folks at the university weren't very happy about that, so they insisted that the owner remove the airplane within 24 hours, and the only choice he had was to saw the wings off outboard of the landing gear, put the tail wheel in a pickup truck, and towed it down the interstate to Billings, Montana, where it languished for several years. Ultimately, it was donated to the Commemorative Air Force, and ultimately it was assigned to the Minnesota wing. And we started the decision was made to restore the airplane as a red tail because the red tails escorted the 380th Bomb Group, 310th Bomb Squadron, and 380th Bomb Group, which is our B-25 Miss Mitchell. So we thought it would be good to have a B-25, a Mustang in red tail colors, escorting our B-25. But the project languished until the late 1990s when a guy named Don Hines, who was a visionary leader and a great guy, former naval aviator, and tenanted our airport, and he saw this project and he believed in it and he took it on. And pretty soon thereafter, in 2001, we had a flying airplane. But sadly, Don was killed in this airplane in 2004 in a tragic power loss and suffered fatal injuries. And so we started over in 2004, and as we were doing that, there's a lot of talk about the Tuskegee Airmen story, and it really is about rising above adversity, and that's what they did, and that's what we used the example of the Tuskegee Airmen to take a pile of busted up airplanes and put it back together again in 5 years and $1 million. But Don always had a bigger plan, and that plan was that we would use this airplane as a tool to tell a story that would inspire young people to rise above the adversity that they find in their lives. And to accomplish that, we had this vision to build a traveling exhibit, which has been here to Oshkosh several times. How many people have seen the Rise Above exhibit? For those of you who have, you know what it's about. The Flight Instructor Handbook says that the definition of learning is a change of behavior as a result of experience. And we wanted to use this story to create an experience for young people that would cause them to change their behavior and hopefully rise above the adversity they find in their lives.
How many hours on this airplane?
This airplane's been flying since 2001, about 800 hours, about 500 of that since the accident.
And in your traveling exhibition, where do you go?
We go all over the country right now. The exhibit's en route from Seattle. We brought this airplane. We were at an air show, Hillsboro, Oregon last weekend, and we brought it just to be here in front of you folks and to be here with Charles, because it's just he's been such a great supporter of us for so many years. So we'll pretty much do whatever we have to do, including fly from Hillsboro, Oregon, to be here, and so we could use this tool to tell the story with Charles.
Great. Doug Rosendahl, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, Charles McGee. You heard a little bit in the video that we just started. Colonel retired, United States Air Force. He was born December 7th, 1919 in Cleveland, Ohio. He was a Boy Scout. He made Eagle, graduated from high school number 9 in his class of 436. 2 years into college at the University of Illinois, he enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces, became a member, as you know, of the famed Tuskegee Airmen, the Red Tails. He earned his pilot wings in June of 43. With the 332nd Fighter Group, he flew the P-47, the P-39, and the P-51 Mustang, escorting B-24s and B-17s over Germany, Austria, and the Balkans. He shot down one Focke-Wulf 190 before he came back to the States as an instructor. In Europe, he flew 137 combat missions. In the Korean War, he flew 100 missions in the P-51 Mustang. And in the Vietnam conflict, another 172 missions in the RF-4 Phantom. In the history of the United States Air Force, Colonel McGee holds the record for flying the most combat fighter missions in 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, 409. He retired after commanding at many levels. Retired in 73. Of course, he is highly decorated, a recipient, among others, of the Distinguished Flying Cross, Bronze Star, Congressional Medal of Honor, the nation's highest civilian award. In 2011, he was inducted in the National Aviation Hall of Fame. Please welcome Colonel Charles McGee.
Thank you. Thank you.
Charles, and I just kind of accented that you were born on December 7th, right, in 1919. Japan, of course, attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, which was your, 22nd birthday.
Yes,
what was the mood of the country before Pearl Harbor Day, the attack, and how did that mood, attitude in the country change after Pearl Harbor?
Well, that's an important question because, the country had come out of 10 years of depression. Everybody was interested in the jobs that they build up industry to support our military folks. And so everyone was interested in being a part of it, but the black population was faced with a lot of restrictions. In fact, to get into aviation, it stems back to a 1925 Army War College study where they determined, physically capable? Yes. Mentally? No, inferior. Morally? Inferior. Just all the facts to say that we wouldn't make good soldiers. We could do service work. In other words, dig ditches, build roads, drive trucks, but do anything technical? Not possible. And they forwarded this study to Washington for future mobilization plans, and Washington bought it. So there was a tough road to face when 1939-40 we decided to help our allies in Europe.
Well, that raises a question, of course, given what was going on at the time, the rampant racism, Jim Crow laws, injustice, segregation, and the Pentagon and this faulty science that you just described. You knew all about that racism, of course, firsthand. So where did it come from in you and your colleagues to be able to say, I will not only join to defend the country, but I'm going to join and fight racism? What did it take inside you to do that?
Well, I think number one, and I think the first thing that we were all thankful that we had parents and grandparents that said, go to high school, go to college, let's get an education. And that was a requirement when the war broke out to have that education. So that was important. In my own kind of growing up, I did learn, I guess you might say from a religious point of view, treat your neighbor as yourself, as you want to be treated. a little later, in my years, I was glad to be a Boy Scout. And I still say that if we all live by that Scout oath and those 12 Scout laws, trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. If we all, yes, indeed, folks, if everybody lived by those laws, we'd have quite a different country. But that was the type of thing that helped me. And I realized fighting doesn't solve an issue. You're bruised and you're still mad at each other. So it takes a little different way of living. And I think that's what sustained the majority of those that became a part of this first experiment, because the Army said we studied and we know it isn't going to work.
So that was the term. They called it the experiment.
Exactly. The experiment was authorizing the 99th Pursuit Squadron. Of course, the fine print to maintain segregation said all of the necessary support. So besides 32 pilots, that's a couple hundred technicians and mechanics, and of course you needed medical and communications and all, so it's almost another couple hundred, supply another couple hundred people, because they insisted on segregation, and that 99th went into combat, taking care of, still segregated overseas, but attached to white groups, but not at the same base.
How are you treated when you first arrived at Tuskegee in that whole training period?
Well, I'll have to, if it wasn't for Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University, things would be quite different, because we were not welcome in the city and town of Tuskegee. The sheriff wasn't a friend, folks. We went through town very carefully, but Tuskegee Institute was able to take care of us while they built the airfield. And that's an interesting part of this circumstance, because the Army had told a graduate of the civilian pilot training school they couldn't use a black pilot because they didn't have any black mechanics. It's very interesting. But so really, now called Tuskegee Airmen, we weren't called Tuskegee Airmen then, were mechanics trained at the technical school, Chanute Field, Rantoul, Illinois. I'm in school just 14 miles away, and that's how I learned about the flying, and applied for the flight program and was accepted, waited around to be called. But that's the way it started. Well, 99th's going to need replacement, so training continued, and 3 additional single-engine fighter squadrons were trained, and then later even 4 squadrons for the medium bomber Mitchell B-25. But that's another part of the story.
You and your colleagues, that let's say first year, before you winged, what was the group attitude amongst all of you? Did they share your kind of solid, positive, reverential attitude that you had? Did all the guys kind of reflect that, or something else?
Well, I think the majority did. There were those who were still very upset over segregation and not kind of affected their attitude, which you could expect for some. But by and large, interested in taking advantage of this opportunity. Some had dreamed of being pilots from the time they were little. I'd never been around an aircraft, but I always say after my first ride, I knew I'd made the right decision. I was avoiding the draft.
Well, so you train and you solo.
Yes.
What do you recall January 24th, 1943? What do you recall about how you felt that day when the instructor climbed out, you stayed, and soloed?
Well, it was a great feeling, and I remember him pointing out, and you can see the airfield over there, and that's how Tuskegee Army Airfield came about. Well, 2 things to complete that story. Although we can't fly, Army policy, a law was passed allowed the Army to contract the primary phase of training to a civilian pilot training school. Tuskegee Institute had an excellent program. They applied and got the contract. And although the Army said it's not going to be successful, my instructor in the PT-17 was a black pilot from Tuskegee Institute's Civilian Pilot Training Program. And the mechanics did well, and that's where the Army said, oh, we need an airfield for pilot training. Well, now there were airfields all around the country, but they found $4 million to build Tuskegee Army Airfield about 7 miles north of the city of Tuskegee, and that's what we were looking at on that first ride. And you said, you see the airfield over there? I'm sure I said yes, but folks, I'm not sure what I was seeing at that time. But fortunately, as I say, I just knew I'd made the right decision, because to be able to loop, roll, and spin, come back, put your feet on the ground, can't beat it.
June of 43, of course, your wings. What's that recollection?
What a great day to be able to complete the training, to receive those silver Army Air Corps wings, and to also be commissioned. And, and I even say we were treated better than the women Air Force service pilots, because they helped our country and were sent home after 2 years. Even though segregation existed, we were commissioned and carried those wings into service. And so it was a little different, although the attitudes in many respects hadn't changed.
July 4, 44, you arrive across the Atlantic. Where did you start across the Atlantic? What base?
Oh, we shipped from our training site in Selfridge Field, Michigan, December of 43, going down to Virginia, where the boats were loaded and took us over, and we went directly to Italy, each of the squadrons on a different boat that was crossing the Atlantic.
Now, what airplane were you flying then, and where was your squadron?
Well, when we, as I say, we were trained in P-40, but they said, no, you're going to fly the P-39. And so one of the boats went directly to Naples. The boat I was on, we landed in the Toronto Bay and were trucked over the mountainside to the Naples area, where we picked up our P-39s and began patrolling Naples Harbor, waterways up to Anzio Beachhead, which was just below Rome.
The word kitten, do you want to go here? The word kitten?
Oh, kitten was my wife's nickname, so we painted that on the thing, but I always said, put it on both sides, because I always said my crew chief kept that engine purring like a kitten, so it had a double meaning for me.
So how long did you fly the P-39?
Well, we, as I say, got over in January of 44. It was about the April time frame. Our bombers had come out of North Africa firing from southern Italy to destroy Germany's war-making potential. Thought I had enough guns on the 17s and 24s to protect them, but the German Air Force was a different story. So they decided to provide additional escort, and they pulled four squadrons, groups rather, from 12th Tactical Air Force. We'd moved over to the Adriatic side of Italy and picked up P-47 Thunderbolts to begin about the April time frame of 44 to begin escorting the B-17s and B-24s.
So you transitioned right then in Italy from the 39 to the P-40?
Well, no, only the 99th was still flying P-40 attached to white groups. They were doing interdiction and ground support. We began the escort work with the P-47.
P-47, I meant, yep.
Yes, and back then, you read the tech order and sat in the cockpit and found the switches. I even said, if the crew chief can start it, I can fly it.
What were your typical missions in the P-47?
Typical mission, we would put up 16 aircraft, have a rendezvous point with a assigned bomber group, and proceed with them. Sometimes we had penetration escorts. Sometimes we were able to stay with them all the way through the mission. sometimes we had egress escorts. So it depended on how far away. You know, Ploesti oil fields were one of the distant targets, and you may not stay with them all the way. So it depended on the assignment that you were given.
At what point did the Mustang become part of the equation?
The famous Mustang, Mike, I always qualify it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. July 1st, all of the 4 fighter groups had the P-51 Mustang, and we preferred that because the P-47 was excellent, roomy cockpit, extra pair of guns, but that big radial nose and its supercharging limited its altitude and range. So the P-51, though, gave us an aircraft that we could operate from the ground to 35,000 feet, good range, good speed. It was a premier aircraft for the task that we had to do.
So what were your mission charges or orders? Was it just to protect the bombers, or was it to attack the Luftwaffe, or both?
Well, it was somewhat of both, but in our leadership, and sometimes those instructions might have been different from those who were flying out of 8th Air Force, but our mission was to help save the bomber crews, because each time a bomber went down, that's 12 lives that could be lost. And so our leadership, Ben Davis Jr., who became our commander, well, he hadn't said, I'll court-martial a pilot that goes happy hunting. That is leaving the assignment because we hear that there are foreign aircraft in the air and you want to go get a victory. If they attacked the bombers we were escorting, we fought them off. If they didn't, we always just said, well, they live another day.
What were the typical Mustang missions? How long were they? How cold did it get up there? Well,
the cockpits weren't quite what they are today for sure, but the higher it went, the colder it got. But our missions, I would say the average mission for us on escort was 4 hours to 4:15 or 4:30. Longest mission I flew in 51, 6 hours. But it was a special mission, and not flying at high cruise and burning fuel very rapidly. But we also, whether it was weather or that kind of case, and the bombers weren't in. No competition with that, but
sound of freedom.
Absolutely, that's worth a clap. Yes, indeed. We were given what we called fighter sweeps, and probably throughout the war period from that April time frame in 44 to the end of the war in 45, we destroyed more German aircraft on the ground than we did in the air. But once the raids of Ploesti oil field and Regan's chemical plants kept them on the ground, and so we went after them there.
How often, I mean, percentage-wise, in number of missions, how often did you see German aircraft? Was it like every time you went up?
There were a few missions that we didn't, but almost every mission we would hear that they're in the air somewhere, whether they're attacked, because there'd be several bomb groups in the air at the same time, and of course you stayed with your assigned group and not having. Not a P-51 for sure.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how much would you like to go fly that?
Well, 1 to 10, probably 10. But thank you. But you know, it's the technology has taken us to a new level. Now I ended up flying F-4s, and somebody asked me, well, how do you compare with F-16, F-15 planes come out there, folks? You don't. Technology has given us something different, and I tell the young folks, how's your computer knowledge? Because we wouldn't be flying if we didn't have the computers. We can't think fast enough, and technology has taken us to a new level in airframe performance, and it takes the computers to get the job done.
Where do the words risk and fear drop into this conversation for you in your experience?
Well, I've been asked, were you afraid and so on. I said, no, we had excellent training. We were with the Southeast Training Command, and I tell folks, if you're afraid or scared, you're in the wrong business. You got to go do something else. So, your adrenaline does get up in circumstances, to say the least. But by and large, with the good training, you knew what the mission was. You had the equipment to accomplish it. So it was a great experience.
But is there any way to really prepare for combat in that experience, no matter how much you train?
Probably not, but we've been able to simulate a lot of circumstances, and so I guess they get you as close as they can to it, but until you're flying there and suddenly realize, hey, somebody's firing back at you, and you take a hit in the plane, that does kind of get your attention just a bit.
The bomber crews. Well, let me back up. When did the business of painting the tails red, how did that begin?
Oh, yeah, folks have asked that question. Really, 15th Air Force was partly responsible for that. I mentioned there were 4 fighter groups picked to begin the escort work, and although I don't remember the numbers for the 325th and the other groups, one had yellow tail, one had candy stripe, one had checkerboard tail. 332nd Fighter Group ended up with the red tail. So the red tail, red nose, and for those that are looking at our P-51 here that Doug mentioned and talked about, are in the 302nd Squadron Colors. In other words, behind the spinner and the trim tab color allowed the crew chiefs to know what aircraft was taxiing in. So we all had the red nose in the 332nd, red nose, red tail, but that behind the spinner helped our crew chiefs know what was going on. And of course, the colors of all of the groups helped the gunners and those B-17s and B-24s know that we were friendly and not them, because up there in the air, aircraft coming in at you nose on, it's pretty difficult to be sure you got the right target in your.
Given, the racism and all that from earlier, how did these bomber crews regard your squadrons?
Well, that's interesting because many of them did not know that the Red Tails were black pilots till well after the war. There were a few that did. In fact, one of the groups, weather kept them from their own base, landed at the Rematelli where we were and were put up and were aware that, and perhaps some surprise too, that the black pilots were flying the red-tailed 51s. But as I say, the majority did not know until well after the war because, as I say, segregation went overseas too, and we didn't attend the same rest camp. I never got to the Isle of Capri during that time frame. We had a villa in Naples area for our rest camp. Some getting to, for a 3-day time, perhaps in Rome when it was free, ran into others, and there was some sharing, but it was very limited.
You all lost friends in the course of all of this.
Yes.
How'd you deal with that?
That's one of the difficult things of combat, to have a friend. In fact, I lost my wingman on his 97th mission. And an accident, and that's a tough thing. But folks, a thing we all regret in war, that there are those who give full measure, and just thankful that a number of us survived. But we can never forget what they accomplished, giving their lives for the freedoms that we so much enjoy. Thank you.
So who was Benjamin O. Davis?
Benjamin O. Davis, for folks that don't know his story, graduated from West Point in 1936 and said he wanted to fly. And I mentioned the War College studied a little earlier. He was denied because they said they have no black units. He became, when the Army said we'll experiment, 99th Pursuit Squadron, he was a captain at the time and went through with the first class. There were 12 cadets, and he as a student officer. He and 4 of the cadets completed the first bit of training for forming the 99th, those 32 pilots that I mentioned. He took the 99th into combat in North Africa, Sicily, came back home to be commander of the 332nd Fighter Group of the other 3 squadrons, and went over again with us as we went over in January of 44, remained as the commander of the unit throughout the wartime.
Describe him as an officer and as a leader.
Well, the way I put it, he definitely let we young, I say Rice, second, first lieutenants know what the task was and what it was all about and why we were there. Highly respected for what he had gone through and what it meant. So we looked up to him. He wasn't an easy person to get close to, well until many years later after the war, and he wrote his book, Tuskegee Airman American, that it just seemed to relax, and you could feel a little closer to him. But he was a great leader, highly respected, and certainly, you'd say, the right man at the right time.
And he achieved what rank, finally?
Well, that's interesting. When he went through training, as I say, he was a captain. His counterparts from West Point were all lieutenant colonels, so they bumped him through major to lieutenant colonel. So he was he ended up with three-star general on service and was promoted with his 4-star in retirement.
So he was the first black 4-star.
No, he was the first black general in the Air Force. The first black 4-star turned out to be Daniel Chappie James.
Now tell us about Chappie James.
Yeah. Chappie James, when I went into training, was one of the instructors in Tuskegee Institute Civilian Pilot Training Program. And as I understand the story, they tried to make the instructors warrant officers rather than civilians, and that didn't go over very well. So they gave them the option of coming on active duty or going back as civilian instructors. And he chose to come on active duty and went through. In fact, when I performed we were both in Korea at the same time. He was in the 12th Squadron, I was in the 67th. But Chappie was one of these all-around people. He could play every instrument in the band. He could play football, basketball, baseball, whatever it was, you name it. But an excellent speaker, he could go down on the waterfront and talk in their language, or he could go to the boardroom. And he caught the eye. There was a time that public speaking was an important asset as you moved along in rank, and he certainly filled that bill. He became commander of NORAD and our air defense instructor, and became the first 4-star general, black general at the Air Force. The program produced 3. There was a major general that handled finance and that type of thing. Chappie and B.O. Davis were the 3 generals from the experience.
We talk a lot about you and the other pilots, but we don't talk a heck of a lot about maintenance and about how you keep thousands of airplanes up in the air in a combat zone and keep them flying on a day-to-day basis. So how'd they do that?
That's a very interesting question, because in the period that we're talking about, we didn't have hangars and the facilities and so on. And as I mentioned, for the 332nd Fighter Group, in training, we switched from the P-40 to the P-39 in combat. We dropped the P-39, picked up P-47, dropped the P-47, picked up P-51s, and the mechanics didn't miss a beat. unfortunately, we're in combat, so there wasn't time to go to school. It was a matter of reading and understanding the tech orders and for them getting their hands greasy out in the weather. We didn't have the hangars and the facilities that are often made available now. Of course, our planes are more technical, maybe need more protection, but we owe an awful lot to those mechanics who, well, I think most of you know, they said, hey, this is my airplane, bring it back.
So how proud were they of what they did? We know you guys are proud of what you did, but how proud were they?
I would say extremely proud, because they knew what it meant for a plane to take off, spend that time in the air, and I don't think anybody was looking any harder when the planes began coming back to see, as they say, if their aircraft came back. You know, they claimed ownership of it, but certainly we owe them a great debt of gratitude for their perseverance, their approach in the circumstances, maintaining and keeping the aircraft that allowed us to do the job in the air.
When you came back to the States, how were you received when you came back to the States after all this sensational performance as an air group?
Well, it hadn't quite taken hold here at home of what we really accomplished at the time, so coming down the gangplank, it was still, signs whites this way and blacks another direction. Did get to send they gave us a week in the so-called rest camp, which happened to be a hotel in Atlantic City, and the folks that were there said, well, this is the first time a black has slept in a room in that hotel. But things began to move slowly as the story and the experience realized it, and folks began to realize that happenstance of birth wasn't what it was all about. It was about access, opportunity, and being prepared.
You decided to stay active. Why?
Well, I did say I was enjoying flying, had great assignments, and actually I'd say I couldn't have written a better script. But also in the late 50s, I've thought about maybe getting out of the service and looking at the airlines, but they weren't hiring black pilots or women for that case at that time. And so I stayed in the service. But as I say, I continued to get wonderful assignments and opportunities, promotions along with it, and that added to the successes that we had achieved. And so, as I say, I was just a lucky guy. And you know what? I actively flew 27 of my 30 years. That
27 of your 30 active?
Of those 30 years of service.
Wow.
Thank you.
So along comes Korea, and what's your rank at this point, and what's your position at this point?
Yes, as I said, I went over to the Philippines as a maintenance officer. They grabbed, a month after I'd been there is when the war broke out, and they grabbed P-51 pilots. I went to Korea with the 67th as the squadron maintenance officer. Lou Sabille, who was our commander, gave his life to destroy a target shortly after we were flying. We flew our first missions out of Japan while they built the first strip inside the Pusan perimeter. But when Lou lost his life, I moved up to the squadron operations officer and eventually received a spot promotion to major there in combat.
You flew the Mustang in Korea. What was that experience? What did you do? What were your goals?
Well, I call the experience in Europe, that was air superiority type flying, and those keep the air clear. Their bombers could do their job. My flying in Korea was all interdiction and ground support. I never saw a MiG, but I'd say they weren't down in the trees where we were, doing the work supporting the ground troops. And that was throughout that mission, but we carried bombs, napalm, rockets, all of the things needed to pursue, as I say, interdiction and ground support type of missions.
At what point did you get your first squadron?
I returned. I had just gotten overseas, as I mentioned, when the war broke out, and I said, rather than come back to the States, which was an option I could, I went back to the Philippines, and as I say, as a major, was assigned to the 44th Fighter Bomber Squadron that remained. That was the third squadron of the 18th Fighter Group that stayed in the Philippines, and got my first jet flying experience and became the commander of the squadron for 2 years.
What was that? Tell us about that first time you pushed the throttle forward in a jet and you flew in a jet.
That was a great experience, and I think those of you who've flown reciprocal and jet engines, but the F-80 didn't have the thrust that we have that we heard going by out here just recently. So to be on the ground and be able to go to 100% and the fire's still burning, let go your brakes and be up at 20,000 feet in just a few minutes was a real thrill, and I enjoyed every bit of it. And I've been asked, well, was it difficult? I didn't think so, because you don't have to deal with prop setting and mixture and so on. You, as I say, if the fire is still burning, you just go enjoy flying, and that's what I did.
So you're skipper of the squadron. How are you treated?
Wonderful. We had a great team, was accomplishing, we might say we were doing the air defense mission for the Philippine Islands, and I was treated very well. And I feel really blessed for the way things worked out. And the example that I could give you, one of our squadron, of course, there was one other black in the squadron, the rest were all white, but one of the white pilot's family came over, and father wanted to do something at the club for everybody, but he told his son I wouldn't be welcome. And his son told him if I wasn't welcome, he could not expect anybody else in the squadron to show up. So that was a great feeling.
You all have heard of Frank Borman, who was in Apollo 8, one of our great astronauts. Tell us your Frank Borman story.
Oh, Frank turned out to be a good friend, he and his wife, but my story with Frank, as I say, I was commander of the 44th Fighter Bomber Squadron. He had come over to the Philippines. He was a second lieutenant at the time, and they used him. They gave him some tasks up at 13th Air Force headquarters, and we had some things going on, and they assigned him down to the 44th Squadron for a period. But he had a problem that had taken him off of flight status. Flight surgeon there in the Philippines, because he wasn't familiar with his history, didn't want to put him back on flying. And we said, of course, we pilots looking out for each other, I think is the way you would put it. We said, well, hey, I have the authority. We'll bootleg some flying time for him and have the flight surgeon monitor it. Flight surgeon agreed. We bootlegged some time for Frank. Turned out well. Got him back on flight status. Of course, later we didn't know he was going to be ending up as an astronaut, but we've been lifelong friends.
So you eventually come back to the States to go to Air Command and Staff in Montgomery, Alabama. Think about the geography of that. With your record, you get to Air Command and Staff, you're what, a major?
At the time, yes, sir.
At the time, a major. So how were you treated at Air Command and Staff and in Montgomery? How much it changed?
Change comes about slowly. In class in the school, we were treated fine, but when I went into the barber shop to get a haircut, the barber started to cut my hair and then paused and said, "Are you black?" I said, "Yes." He refused to complete my haircut, so we had to get to the base commander, and they got a barber out of the city and set up a room where we could get our haircut. And also while there, of course, I was able to find a house to rent while I was in school because my family was there, and I still don't know what I said, but I had to tell my oldest daughter at the time that she couldn't play in that park that was a block and a half away. As I say, I still don't know what I said, but she turned out to be pretty good after all, so things improved.
So on to Southeast Asia and a new airplane, the RF-4 Phantom. What was it like when you started flying the Phantom compared to the P-80?
Great experience. They started two new tactical reconnaissance squadron, the 12th and the 16th. We all went through reconnaissance school together and then out to Mountain Home, Idaho to get in the aircraft. Went through survival training and then over to the Philippines and I found out that I took the 16th Squadron to Tan Son Nhut Air Base in South Vietnam, and the other lieutenant colonel, I had been promoted by this time, took the 12th Squadron to Thailand, but we were doing the tactical reconnaissance.
How risky was that flying compared to, say, flying over North Vietnam?
Yeah. Well, you know somebody's firing back at you when you go over the targets, and for those that don't know, in the RF, we had no weapons. Our defense was speed. So in the highly defended areas, we just flew a little faster to sure many times. Of course, you didn't know it at night. You could see the tracers trailing off behind you, so you just said, thank goodness for the speed that you could avoid being hit. Although I had no scratch in my flying the 100 and some missions in Europe. I did get airplane hit in Korea, but was able to get back to home base. Did get aircraft hit in over Laos. Oh, we didn't fly over Laos. Yes, we did. But
yeah, because that was yeah. Right.
But yeah, I couldn't get back to home base, but fortunately I was able to get the plane to a safe base, and my backseater pulled our photographic equipment out, and we bummed a ride back to home base in Tan Son Nhut. Kept on going.
So there was the third war, bunch of missions, 136, 137 missions. To give you again, I'll repeat, he holds the record and will, historically in the United States military, for flying the most combat missions in 3 wars in the history of the United States Air Force.
Fighter combat.
Fighter combat.
Important is fighter. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, you get back to the States, and you are the first black base and wing commander ever in the United States Air Force. How fulfilling was that for you? Yes.
Well, you might say it's a second, but when I mentioned that integration takes place slowly, Lockburn Air Base was a wing-based operation by B.O. Davis that they closed the Air Force closed it in 1st of July 1949. We were scattered around the world.
Lockbourne is in Ohio?
Lockburn in Ohio, now Rickenbacker Air Base. So even when training closed in 46 at Tuskegee Army Airfield, we were all shipped to Lockburn. So through that time, the Army never changed the policy. It took the Air Force's action when they became a separate service in 47 to say, we need to use people based on training and experience and where needed, not the happenstance of birth, and we're not getting enough money to keep Lockburn Air Base open but separate to meet our requirements. We need to integrate. And for those who know the history, I'd say a very courageous President, Harriet Tubman, the one that said the buck stops here, 10 months later issued Executive Order 9981 mandating that all of the services need to integrate. And I think, he said Congress wasn't doing anything. His advisor saying you're moving too fast. But he stuck to his guns and helped bring about a change that has proven to be important to our country and still is, because we're more diverse now than we were then.
How significant was your entire, what we now call Tuskegee Airman experiences? And your performance over all those years, how significant was that leading to the integration of all the military?
Yeah, well, some folks say it was an early step in civil rights. We didn't believe that. But what we accomplished, although they, in their study, the Army War College called them facts, we said we dispelled the biases and generalizations that pretty much were, and the attitudes that believed that because you were a minority person, you didn't have the qualities to support what was needed for us to maintain our freedoms, if you will, and that we enjoy. It turned out to be it's the education and having the opportunity and then proving yourself, and we were able to do that.
Show us please and tell us, what is the double V mean?
Oh, any folks out, you heard of double V back during the war? Any hands on that? Well, what double V turned out to be was, and I believe it was what the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the black newspapers, said that we were fighting a double V program. First V is for victory against Hitlerism in Europe, and then later what was going on in the Pacific. And the second V was fighting against racism here at home. And the Tuskegee program really had a big part to do with both of those victories. Although they didn't get into combat, the 477th Bomb Group, flying the Mitchell B-25 and preparing to go to the Pacific, fought that battle against racism in their training. Army regulations had said that there should be no segregation based on race, creed, or color. There were those that didn't want to believe it. Colonel Selway was one of them, and he had General Hunter's approval to write a base regulation that read, on his base, trainees could only use the facilities he designated. Well, bomb group were all black. They were training, but they couldn't go to the officers' club and so on. Well, the officers knew what Army regulations called for, and they tried to enter the club peacefully in twos and threes and were rejected. And of course, this upset Colonel Selway, so he had called them in and said he'd like them to read his regulation and sign a stipulation that they would abide by it. 101 refused because they knew what Army regulations said, but they were immediately shipped off from their Indiana training base to Godman Field, Kentucky, put behind barbed wire guards and all of this. Well, that brought a hearing out of Washington. They knew Colonel Selway was wrong. They dismissed him. But as I say, the Army didn't change the policy. So they said, well, what do we do? They decided the war's over in Europe, got this situation there. We'll have a composite group. We'll keep 2 of the B-25 squadrons. We'll reactivate the 99th Pursuit Squadron. And this composite group, that's when they opened up Lockburn Air Base south of Columbus, Ohio, for this segregated operation. And as I say, in 46, when they closed training at Tuskegee, those of us that were there, we were shipped to Lockburn Air Base. But when they moved to, or when the Air Force decided to eliminate segregation, they really didn't keep the composite group. They reactivated the 332nd Fighter Group, and they were flying P-47Ns. In fact, the pilots flying the P-47N were the top guns in the reciprocating engine phase of the first Air Force gunnery meet. This is May of 1949, but as I say, it was 1st of July, the Air Force was able to complete the action and close the segregated base.
As you look back over your career, your 32 years in the Air Force, how much of that experience were your parents able to follow and know what you were doing?
Well, unfortunately, I lost my mother very early in life, but my dad had served as a chaplain in both World War I and World War II. But he was aware and attended my graduation when I got wings, but so he was fully aware of the fact that one time the whole family was in. I had a sister who was a WAC, my brother was a signal officer, I got my Army Air Corps wings, and as I say, Dad was a chaplain, so we had all served.
What does your whole career mean to you? As you describe, the breadth of it and the success of it, what's it mean to you?
Well, I'd just say life's been a blessing. It's led to a good life. I was able, post-service, to serve in business in Kansas City, Missouri area, and had a good life. But one day my wife said she'd like to go fishing a little more often. And I said, I don't really need to be punching clocks. So I retired again, and we went fishing.
What are the challenges to our country today as you look around and see where we are in the world and here at home? What are the challenges today?
Well, I like to talk to young folks, and I get a chance to go to some schools, particularly middle school, because the middle school kids listen. High school kids don't listen very much anymore. But well, I give it to them in this way. The value experiences that sustained us are still important today, but I tell the young folks, I put it in 4 P's: perceive, prepare, perform, persevere. But perceive, dream your dreams, but I like to add, as you find your talents, hopefully find something you enjoy doing, because I hate to go to work every day but hate what you're doing. But prepare, I say, get a good education, read, write, and speak well, but develop the talents that, we're losing some of that because they don't even teach kids how to write anymore in some schools. But prepare, perform. And I say let excellence be your goal in everything that you do. And tell the youngsters, never less than your best. Because if you're doing less than your best, you're letting yourself down, you're letting your family down, your community. But finally, persevere as we did. Because, back then they always thought a large group of blacks get together, it's going to be riots, it's going to be this. And we had guns and we didn't go after anybody with those guns. But persevere. Don't let the circumstances be the excuse for not achieving. Can't beat that, I don't think. And that's what I like to pass on.
Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Charles McGee.
Thank you kindly.
So you start the pre-flight in the Mustang up here in the cockpit. I'm going to make sure the mags are off and the trims are zeroed. Turn all those back to 0 to make sure everything's in tune there. And then we'll check my fuel status right here and my coolant pressure. And then we'll hop off the wing back here and start the pre-flight on the ground. One of the things that on the Mustang that's key is the flap actuator. There's a yoke in there that pushes the flaps down. And the first notch of flaps on the Mustang's at 400 miles an hour. So there's a tremendous amount of stress on that. And if you overspeed the flaps, you can bend this yoke in there. And so you always want to take a look at that and make sure that that's not bent down in there. And then we'll move outboard. We can pull the caps off, take a look in the fuel tank, make sure we have fuel and make sure the cap's secure. These are the gun bay doors. In the C model Mustang, it only had 2 guns. The D model had 3 on each side. And they were laid on an angle in the C model, and they had jamming problems, and they fixed that in the D model. We're really concerned about these doors because I'm told if those doors come open in flight, the airplane won't fly. So we pay special attention that the handles are down and that the Zeus fasteners are latched. The ammo bays, same difference here. We need to make sure that they're fully engaged and the Zeus fasteners are latched. One of the really interesting things about the Mustang is the way that they actuated the ailerons. There's a pulley in here that turns, and it's got a arm that goes into a bearing, so they were able to make the ailerons actuate without having a bell crank that's protruded up or above or below the wing. It's a really ingenious, cool design, and there's lots of really good engineering in a North American airplane, and this aileron hinge is one of the best. I just really enjoy the machinery and how this works. Trim tabs on a high-speed airplane are always critical. Want to make sure there's no play, and we zeroed the trim to make sure that they're flush at 0, so the calibration is correct. General condition out here on the wing, you know, just taking a look at everything. This airplane's been modified to have outboard fuel vents. Some of the Mustangs with inboard fuel vents, when you do aerobatics, you end up with gas fumes in the cockpit. This nice modification that keeps the air in the cockpit nice and clean. These spade doors on the Mustang are take a lot of stress, so we always want to check the integrity of those. Wheel cover and the linkages that hold the spade doors on. Again, we're just looking for the general security. The brake line here. There's an uplock roller on the bottom of the gear leg, and you always want to make sure that that's free. It hooks into a hook in here that holds the gear up. And when you're pulling G's, there's a lot of weight on that landing gear. And so it's imperative that that uplock functions correctly, so that as you pull G's, the gear wouldn't come out, because this gear door coming open at high speed would be very devastating to the structure of the wing. Down here in the wheel well is one of the places where you'll see a dramatic difference between the C and the D model. While the gear leg and the basic function of the gear is exactly the same as the D model, all of the linkages, sequence valves are considerably different. The C model is much simpler. The gear door on a D model is a much different design. It would have forward latching hooks in here and internal latching. This is a much simpler design, but they had some trouble, again, with these gear doors coming open at high speeds with devastating consequences. We want to make sure that the uplock is in position here and the fuel selector valve's not leaking. And just general condition, coolant pipes are up here in the wheel well. You know, the Mustang is a water-cooled engine, and the radiator's in the back, so we're carrying lots of volume of really hot water. And if there was any problem in those cooling pipes, that would again be a bad thing. So we're looking for coolant leaks, hydraulic leaks, and fuel leaks here in the wheel well. The Merlin engine was really one of the things that made the Mustang different than the other airplanes of the day. Because it's water cooled, it was very narrow, and because it had a 2-stage supercharger, it was able to operate at the really high altitudes. This airplane had a 41,000-foot service ceiling, which is just unheard of in those days. And if you can imagine a young lieutenant flying at 41,000 with no pressurization, just on an oxygen mask, a small leak in an oxygen mask could have been fatal. So it was a very hostile environment to operate the airplane, but it was again, the supercharging system in the Merlin that made that possible, and that's one of the things that really made the difference with the Mustang. It's a 12-cylinder engine, V12. Each has an individual exhaust stack, so we want to check the integrity of these exhaust stacks. Behind this panel is the header tank where we would check the coolant level. We maintain a pressure in the cooling system so we can tell in the cockpit whether there's been any leaks or breaches in the cooling system, because really the cooling system is the heart and soul of this airplane, and also its Achilles heel. So we're always thinking about the cooling system when we're flying a Mustang. The Hamilton Standard Hydramatic propeller was one of the things that really made the difference for the Allied forces. Hamilton Standard built these propellers both for the single and the multi-engine airplanes. In the multi-engine airplanes, they were feathering, and it was a great technological innovation that we had a much better technology than any of the Axis forces. And I think this is 11 foot 2 inches, if my memory serves. It's a big propeller when you're sitting behind it. This is the Carburetor Air Scoop. The carburetor's on the back of the engine on the bottom, so it's an updraft carburetor. So the intake air goes through an induction trunk all the way underneath the engine. The carb heat box and air filter boxes would be underneath the engine in the center, and then it goes all the way to the back and up into the carburetor. and then to the blower. As we move around the other side of the airplane, it's pretty much the same as the left side. We're checking the integrity of the exhaust stacks, no cracks, nothing loose. We're looking in the wheel well. In this wheel well, we have the hydraulic accumulator, and we want to check the nitrogen precharge on the hydraulic accumulator. North American airplanes are very hydraulic. You know, some Boeing airplanes of World War II tended to be more electric, but the North American airplanes are very hydraulic, and the gear, the flaps, lots and lots of hydraulic systems on these airplanes, and so we're always concerned about the hydraulic system. Again, we're going to check the integrity of the gear spade door and the uplock roller on this side as well, looking at brakes and brake leaks. Brakes are really critical in these big airplanes because they have a lot of mass and they land pretty fast, and so no brakes is a terrifying thing. So we're always looking for hydraulic fluid leaks around the brakes. The radiator of the airplane, again, we said this is a water-cooled airplane, so it is cooled by a radiator. And the radiator is a great big, it's about this long and about this tall in the whole width of the airplane. The airplane has two cooling systems, one which cools the engine and one which cools the intercooler. When you compress the air at those high altitudes, the compression of that air makes heat. And so that would cause detonation in the engine if you didn't mitigate that. So the way they mitigated that was with a water-cooled intercooler, and it comes back here. So here's the radiator, and in front and below that is the oil cooler. So there's an oval oil cooler inside the scoop. We'll see the scoop on the front side again. And then there's these doors. This is the radiator for the cooling door, and then there's another door that you can't see right underneath the airplane, which regulates the airflow coming out of the oil cooler. We manage the temperature of both the oil and the coolant by moving these oil coolers up and down, and there's a automatic system with a thermostat that automatically regulates that in the automatic mode, or you can run it manually as well. But as we said before, the cooling system in this airplane was both its secret and its curse. So if you got one bullet in that radiator and lost coolant, the airplane was going to be a glider in a matter of a few moments. So it's a really critical system, and we pay a lot of attention to it. If you were to look back up in the cooling door, you can see the back of the radiator. It's a very large radiator, very heavy, full of 100 degrees centigrade or 210 degree Fahrenheit water, and it provides really good cabin heat both winter and summer in the cockpit. The tail wheel is retractable, hydraulically again retractable, and the doors close. Everything about the Mustang was designed to be simple and clean and sleek. So as you look at the lines of the Mustang, they're all long and they're straight. The airplane was built out of a lot of flat skin and straight extrusions, so it could be easy to build, and hence they were able to take this airplane from a drawing on a napkin at a dinner meeting to rolling out a prototype in 117 or 119 days. And that was a tribute to the American ingenuity that we had at that time that helped us prevail in World War II. We talked about the Tuskegee Airmen. You know, all the different squadrons had markings, and just by happenstance, the Tuskegee Airmen's marking was a red tail. Red looks good on any airplane, and I think it looks great on this airplane. But the red tail is an iconic symbol of the Tuskegee Airmen. So we wear this red tail at the Rise Above Squadron as a badge of honor. The control surfaces on the tail are fabric covered. In World War II, they knew that lighter control surfaces were less prone to flutter, and it wasn't exactly clearly understood. Later in the war and on the D model, they made these out of aluminum, but in the C's, A's, B's, and C's, the control surfaces are fabric covered. We've got a big counterweight here. Again, a trim tab, elevator trim tab is even more critical than the aileron trim tabs. Here's our rudder, fabric covered as well. And we're checking to make sure that we've got zero deflection on the rudder trim that we've selected in the cockpit. Coming around to the other side, it's just a mirror image, trim tabs, elevator integrity, fabric, no holes, no problems. Tail wheel pressure, inflation. If we weren't sitting in the grass, we could have a real good sense of how much tail wheel inflation we had just by looking at it. But there's a lot of weight on this tail wheel, so we want to make sure that we've got good tail wheel tire pressure. And Another panel here where we would service the oxygen tank. It's inside of the aft fuselage. And that brings us back to where we started, and we're ready to go flying.
One question for you here, or two questions. What was the range of the airplane with the drop tank?
With drop tanks, the secret of the Mustang was it was the first airplane that would go to Berlin and back.
Yes.
And so that was about an 8-hour mission. And so, you know, the range you would have had to pull the power way back to achieve that, to fly with the bombers. So 8 hours at 200 knots, probably in the 1,500 mile range, I'm gonna guess.
All right, and the armament on here, you got 450 caliber?
450 caliber Browning automatic rifles.
How much ammo did you carry?
Well, you know, there's a old saying, the whole 9 yards, and supposedly it had 27 feet. I don't know whether that's to each gun or to the whole airplane, but I think it was to each gun. The boxes would carry 27 feet for each gun.
Thank you.
Thank you.